Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're here to process that mountain of information you need to conquer, distill it all down to its potent core, and then give you the context to make you genuinely well.
And our mission today is, well, it's dedicated to a case study that, frankly, has been very hard for people to look at dispassionately over the last 5 years.
That's putting it mildly. We are unpacking a massive stack today. They detail one of the most polarizing and I think structurally fascinating cultural shifts of the last half decade. We're talking about the controversy around J.K. Rowling.
Specifically, the fierce ideological battle over the definitions of sex and gender. We're going to trace its evolution pretty meticulously from 2020 all the way through 2025.
Right. And let's be really clear about our objective here for you, the listener. This dive is not about endorsing one side or, attacking another.
Absolutely not. This is purely a data-driven, timeline-based effort. We're here to chart two distinct, simultaneous phenomena that the source material lays out so clearly. The dramatic collapse of institutional, elites' support for a globally beloved cultural icon.
Okay.
And on the other hand, the seemingly unbreakable endurance of her general public approval.
It really is the ultimate modern paradox of fame and cultural power, isn't it? I mean, how could a figure be simultaneously described by our sources as the most liked author in the English-speaking world?
And we were talking about massive, sustained global popularity.
Exactly. And at the same time, be labeled the most institutionally ostracized cultural figure of the modern age. That conflict, that tension between a light disapproval and popular resilience, that is the central thing we have to analyze.
And for you, this is crucial if you want to understand where the real power structures lie in defining cultural legitimacy today. We need to distinguish clearly between, let's say, cultural establishment approval.
So you mean like the major media news desks, literary academia, arts funding boards, that sort of thing?
Precisely. We need to distinguish between that and general public sentiment. And maybe most pivotally, we need to show how major legal and clinical decisions ultimately intervened in this whole cultural dispute. They provided this decisive third-party intervention that, well, it effectively changed the entire narrative trajectory for everyone.
I have to mention the opening statement in our source stack. It just sets the emotional stakes so perfectly. It's brutal.
What does it say?
The transcript quotes someone memorializing her reputation back in 2020. In memory of J.K. Rowling, she ain't dead, but she killed her own career by proudly hating trans people, and no one would really miss her that much anyway.
Wow.
Yeah. That's the starting premise for the whole backlash narrative. But then the sources immediately contrast this really emotional take with the conclusion that 2025 saw her gradual vindication. Mm-hmm. So we need to follow the data, follow the institutional timeline, and understand exactly how that reversal happened.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this, because for anyone who was, living through 2020, that initial reputation implosion, it felt total.
It really did.
The sheer force of the backlash, the condemnation from the actors of her own franchise, the media coverage, it all made it seem like the entire world had turned on. But the polling data you shared, it tells a very different story, a story of segment.
It does. We have to clearly distinguish between what the sources call the cultural establishment track and the public approval track.
They're two separate tracks.
Two very separate tracks. And understanding that difference reveals this structural bias in how these conflicts get presented to the public. The cultural establishment track, that's defined by the cohort who really shape reputational legitimacy.
So the editors, literary critics, festival organizers, arts board members, journalists.
Exactly. And between, let's say, 2015 and 2020, as our sources note, these elite cultural spaces, they shifted. They shifted dramatically and very quickly toward an identity-based affirmative stance on gender.
Right. And so when Rowling took her stand, this institutional class, they reacted immediately, decisively. This is the track where all the drama was so visible.
It's where you saw the institutional disavowal, publishing houses having these tense internal meetings about how to handle her book.
And of course, the immediate, very public opposition from the young Harry Potter film stars. Emma Watson, Daniel Radcliffe, that was huge.
That was huge. And this rapid, highly visible collapse in elite opinion, it produced what felt like a total reputational implosion.
That feeling, that's the critical point, isn't it?
It is. Because it was a stressful phenomenon. When you, the listener, consume news, you are primarily consuming the opinions and reactions of this elite class. Media outlets, arts institutions, they're structurally biased toward covering and prioritizing that cultural establishment view.
And the big corporations, the arts institutions, they optimize their decisions not for what the general public thinks, but for elite.
They're terrified. They are terrified of being branded non-progressive by critics and editors. So that initial loud public ostracization was a structural signal of elite disapproval, but it wasn't necessarily a true reflection of sentiment among among the broader consumer base.
That makes so much sense. The feedback loop just amplifies the noise from the cultural establishment, making their consensus feel universal. But you're saying when we cut through all that noise and look at the actual data tracking the public's enduring favorability, the story changes.
Drastic. It does. Despite the massive, sustained noise of cancellation, Rowling remained a widely liked author. She had immense, enduring cultural influence.
And the data backs this up.
Oh, yeah. The sources cite extensive morning consult data. It tracks her net favorability among U.S. adults between 2018 and 2022.
Which is the absolute peak period of the backlash.
Exactly. And look, her net favorability did fall. It fell substantially by 23 points overall.
And I imagine that drop was concentrated among younger demographics, right? The ones more aligned with those institutionals.
Correct. For millennials, net favorability was down 31 points. For Gen Z, it was down 36. That's a steep drop in just 4 years.
It is.
However, and this is the crucial nuance that the media coverage rarely conveyed. Even at her absolute low point in 2022, Rowling still retained a net favorability among U.S. adults overall.
Wait. So even at her lowest point, she was still net positive. How do we reconcile those, dry polling numbers with the absolute feeling at the time that she was universally canceled? And
it's a perfect illustration of that structural bias we were just talking about.
Yeah.
The narrative that she was universally hated, it just didn't hold up in the polling data. The public sentiment was simply far more divided and far less intensely negative than the elite sentiment suggested.
So if, say, 40% of the public likes you and 30% dislike,
the media focuses intensely on that 30% who dislike, especially if that 30% includes the most powerful cultural gatekeeper.
And what's fascinating is the rebound. It started even before the major institutional decisions that we're going to cover later. A follow-up morning consult piece in April 2023 showed that among self-identified Harry Potter fans, her core audience, the share holding a very favorable opinion of her actually rose.
It rose from 34% to 40% in about a year.
That's a 6-point rise in strong approval. That's a significant indicator.
It is. It shows resilience and maybe a backlash to the backlash within her core readership. These were the people who most intensely felt that cognitive dissonance of loving the book while being told their creator was unacceptable.
So that data suggests they were deciding to, compartmentalize or export her?
Or both, prioritizing their long-standing connection to the franchise over the immediate demands of the cultural establishment.
And if we shift to the UK perspective, the data there offers even clearer evidence of her.
Yeah, the YouGov Entertainment polling in September 2024 showed 41% of Britons liked Rowling, 21% disliked her, and 31% were neutral,
leaving her with a net positive score of 20.
A 20-point net positive is the opposite of a pariah figure. And when YouGov did its 2025 all-time writers ratings, Rowling got a massive 58% positive opinion against only 16% negative. She remained, by every objective measure, highly regarded as a writer by the general public, regardless of the storm around her activism.
And the sources provide this really powerful statistical link between her popularity and her specific act. The Electoral Calculus Survey from April 2025, it asked explicitly about her ideological work. The question was, do you approve or disapprove of author J.K. Rowling's efforts to help fund organizations that advocate for women?
And the results were decisive. 47% approved and only 18% disapproved.
That's a net approval of 29 points for her actual specific controversial ideology.
Right. This isn't just about liking the Harry Potter books. This is the public endorsing the very stance that had led to her institutional ostracization.
So if we look at the data from 2020 through 2025, the initial ostracization was absolutely real, but it was confined to that class, the people who shaped the narrative.
While the general public, the people who assumed the culture, they never truly abandoned.
Which sets the stage for the next question. What exactly did she say that triggered this monumental institutional collapse?
To understand the reaction, we have to look really closely at the source of the conflict, which started in early 2020. The sources traced two key incidents that, taken together, signaled her complete break from the emerging progressive consensus on gender rights.
The very first spark, this was months before the global, involved her support for Maya. She was a tax specialist who lost her job over some trans-related.
That's right. Rowling tweeted in December 2019, but it really gained traction in early. She said, "Dress however you please. Call yourself whatever you like. Sleep with any consenting adult who will have you.
No.
Live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real. #EastStandWith."
And that four-stater tweet was the opening rupture.
It was. It signaled to the institutional left that she prioritized the biological definition of sex over the concept of gender identity being legally paramount.
And then came the explosive escalation in June 20. She retweeted an obscure op-ed piece. It was about a women's global health initiative that used the bureaucratic phrase.
And she responded with a rhetorical question that immediately caused global outrage. She wrote, "People who menstruate," sure there used to be a word, someone help me out, women, wimpun, would.
It's hard to overstate how big that moment was.
Oh, that tweet instantly crystallized the opposition. It was seen as mocking the language of inclusion and actively challenging the idea that biological sex terminology is exclusionary or harmful. Within days, she was subject to intense
And in her defense, she followed up with this lengthy 3,600-word post. It was an attempt at a really complicated, deeply nuanced defense of her.
She certainly tried for nuance. She wrote, "If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives."
And she spent a lot of time trying to validate the rights of trans. She wrote, "I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the trans."
But this is where the messaging became structurally confusing, as the sources suggest. She was trying to reconcile two viewpoints that her opponents insisted were, well, irreconcilable in the current political climate.
Which were.
On one hand, she offered full affirmation. Trans rights are human rights. Trans lives matter. Trans people deserve empathy and protection. But on the other hand, she offered fierce contestation. Trans ideology should be fiercely contested, particularly in law and medicine, and transition should not be rapidly of youth.
And she took issue with the foundational tenet of a lot of modern trans activism, the idea that gender identity is innate, sufficient to override biological sex in all legal and in context.
She detailed her opposition. She stated she found assertions that biological women don't have common experience, like menstruation or the experience of male violence, to be deeply misogynistic and regressive.
The sources highlight that the specific issue driving her activism was her concern about erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. This is a crucial distinction to clarify.
It is. Let's pause there and make that distinction absolutely clear. When we talk about the legal distinction between sex and gender in the context of the UK Equality Act 2010, what exactly was she so concerned about losing?
Okay, so break that down for us.
She was concerned about the definition of woman. The Equality Act specifically provides exemptions, they're known as single-sex exceptions, that allow organizations like prisons, domestic violence shelters, and single-sex sports to restrict services based on biological sex. So if the law were changed to define woman purely by gender identity, which is an internal feeling, rather than sex, which is biological reality, then those single-sex spaces could no longer legally exclude biological males who identify as women.
So her argument was that this erosion would directly threaten vulnerable women who rely on those sex-segregated spaces for safety, security, and equal opportunity.
Exactly. It wasn't just abstract philosophy for her. It was a fundamental concern about the legal scaffolding that protects single-sex provisions.
And she coupled this legal concern with clinical concerns about youth transition, citing research on something called rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD.
Right. We hear the term ROGD frequently, but what does she use it to explain, and how did she back that up?
Well, ROGD refers to the phenomenon, often seen in adolescents, where the onset of gender dysphoria appears suddenly. It often coincides with social influence within peer groups or, online communities, rather than a lifelong, consistent present dysphoria.
And she cited researchers who found high percentages, ranging from 60 to 90% in some studies, of gender dysphoric teens who will eventually grow out of their dysphoria if not medically intervened upon.
That distinction between the traditional lifelong presentation of dysphoria in older individuals and this modern rapid onset presentation in adults, that was massive in her defense.
It was. She contrasted the modern explosion of activism, which urged the removal of almost all robust systems for youth seeking sex reassignment, with the long and rigorous process of evaluation, psychotherapy, and stage transformation that older transitioners historically went through.
And she was very clear about the security implications, state. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he is a woman, then you open the door to any and all men who wish that.
But despite the detailed defense post, which was long, it was nuanced, the broader, distracted public, and especially the cultural gatekeepers, they were unlikely to grasp the full complexity of her arguments about law and clinical standards.
No, the public saw the soundbite, the people who menstruate, and the immediate, intense pushback from activists and allies.
And the sources emphasized that the cultural moment at the time was one of bracing social change. There was this powerful narrative that stubbornly determined young voices were finally being heeded.
And in that context, a lengthy defense post about the intricacies of the Equality Act and clinical psychology, it was in effect. Her broad public support was lost among the overwhelming opposition from those with the platforms for shaping cultural narratives, the cultural establishment.
Right. And despite the public confusion over her precise message, the backlash was immediate. But we know the counter-support was there, too.
Yeah, but that initial support, the endorsements, the petitions, it failed to cohere into a solid, sticking counter. And the reason for that, her strange ideological, which our sources call the problem of ideological.
That's a crucial term. Rowling occupied a unique and politically inconvenient space. She was, as the sources put it, perfect for progressives to attack, but not quite suited for conservatives to champion.
Because she is fundamentally a mainstream progressive, right? A high-profile philanthropist, fiercely pro-gay rights, an outspoken feminist.
And left liberal on almost every axis except the definition of biological sex. This made her a traitor figure to the institutional left, which explains why the attacks were so visceral and so personal.
And on the other side, she was simultaneously unsuitable for the right's standard conservative martyr template. Martyrs need to be symbols of ideological purity, usually aligning themselves with the broader conservative or popular movement. She never did that.
No, she never signaled a broader ideological realignment, nor did she frame her fight as, generalized opposition to wokeism or anything like that.
In fact, she actively refit that script. The sources note she wrote this aggressive passage against patriarchal violence, and she cited both the former leader of the free world's long history of sexual assault accusations and incel culture as primary example threats to women.
That's not the standard rhetoric of a conservative culture war. She didn't deliver the necessary cultural script for the right to weaponize her effectively. Right-wing audiences were already conditioned to see Harry Potter as a liberal-coded, diverse franchise.
They couldn't just adopt her as one of their own without some serious cognitive dissonance.
And the money factor is key, too. The left tried to destroy her symbolically, but they couldn't touch her economically.
Right. The right-wing media often prefers heroes who are economically crushed and need rescuing, who lose their book deals or their platform. Rowling never needed saving from financial ruin, which lessened the emotional potency of the narrative.
She existed in this unique geopolitical space, too progressive for the tribal left, to biologically realist for the tribal right, leaving her largely out on her own.
An important sociological observation, she lacked a protective political flank. Yet, despite this isolation, a pretty formidable list of high-profile celebrities did come to her defense.
That list is significant. Jim Broadbent, John Cleese, Helena Bonham Carter, Ralph Fiennes, Robbie Coltrane, Eddie Redmayne, even Tom Felton. But why did their support fail to shift the narrative? That's the question. Because the support was piecemeal. It was scattered across various outlets, and crucially, its messaging was muddled. The sources reveal a critical distinction. The public perceived this celebrity support, not necessarily as agreement with her views on gender,
but as condemnation of the harsh vitriol with which she was being attacked, the death threats, the calls for her to be banned, the extreme hostility.
Exactly. So those celebrities could speak about discourse and civility without full partisan entanglement. They were essentially saying, I don't necessarily agree with her, but she doesn't deserve this.
Which allowed them to remain relatively safe in the institutional space while simultaneously off support.
Precise. But by focusing on civility rather than endorsing her core points about biological sex, they kept the underlying ideological narrative confused rather than solidifying a strong, clear, pro-Rowling counter-narrative.
We see the power of that elite versus public divide so starkly in the petition dynamic. There was a large counter-petition that got, 23,000 signatures in support of Rowling?
A hefty number. But it was drowned out in terms of institutional weight by the anti-Rowling pro-trans statement, which only had 1,500 signatures.
So why did the smaller petition have more impact?
Because that 1,500 signature petition carried more weight and impact despite its low number, because it was, and this is a quote, chock-a-block full of industry professionals, especially in publishing.
So editors, literary agents, reviewers, publicists, her own professional world.
Right. It reflected a deep groundswell of sentiment within the cultural establishment itself. So even though the sources note that many signatories were modest, profiled people, copywriters, graphic designers, librarians, the fact that they were from the same professional ecosystem as Rowling meant the institutional indictment cut through into the public consciousness much more effectively than a petition signed by 23,000 anonymous fans.
It was a sign of professional disapproval. And the indictment went even further, with 4 authors resigned from the Blair Partnership, her literary.
Fox Fisher, Drew Davies, Ugla Stefania Johns-Duer, they all publicly stated they could no longer work with the agency after it refused to issue a public statement of support for transgender rights.
And what was the agency's response?
The agency affirmed its commitment to diverse voices and freedom of speech while refusing the demand to have staff re-educated. However, 4 authors stepping away seemed like this massive public indictment of Rowling herself at the time.
I remember that. The press emphasized the moral high ground of the departing authors.
It did, and it demonstrated the immense narrative power of professional dissent when leveraged by the cultural establishment. For the first few years, the narrative was fixed. Rowling was wrong, the institutions were united, and her support was just scattered noise.
Okay, so here's where it gets really. After a couple of years of her being isolated, with her status appearing to teeter and her being viewed by many as a pariah, the ground started dramatic.
And the sources suggest the biggest threat to the affirm first model of trans activism turned out not to be the political right, but the highly educated, pedigreed institutionalism that the movement thought was entirely on its side.
That's the critical turning point, isn't it? a lesson in political misidentification.
It is. And the early indicators in 2023 were, well, they were almost trivial compared to the institutional shift, but they were telling. For instance, the activist-led boycott of the Hogwarts Legacy video game.
Yeah.
It failed abjectly.
It was so heavily publicized, there were numerous calls for consumers to avoid the game because of Rowling, yet the game was a massive commercial success.
Everyday gamers and consumers were, as the sources put it, incredulous at the histrionic and the effort to judge them for their purchase. The so-called boycott was completely brushed aside. It showed that activist power from the cultural establishment didn't necessarily translate into buying power among the general public.
We also saw shifts in institutional policy, like FINA, the international swimming body, deciding against allowing trans athletes to perform competitive, citing scientific advantages.
But that ideological misidentification of the core opponent is fascinating. The popular trans commentator Natalie Wynn, or ContraPoint, she argued that the real threat was the Republican Party. She saw Rowling and other TERFs as useful idiots who provided a concerned female face to patriarchal violence.
And that analysis fundamentally misidentified the actual challenge that was brewing.
Completely. The movement had successfully captured the narrative in media and the arts, and they assumed that the educated, pedigreed institutionalism, the medical boards, the clinical standards, the legal framework was inevitably coming around to their side, or at least would remain passive.
But disorientingly, it was those deep, nonpartisan institutions that became the source of the profound rupture.
And that rupture started in the medical field with the Tavistock inquiry. Beginning around 2020, Tavistock's Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, which was once seen as pioneering in the UK, was quickly recast as a site of profound professional unease.
What were the specific issues that clinicians were reporting internal?
The sources detail systemic failures. Clinicians reported internal pressure for rapid movement toward medical intervention. That means puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, even when serious comorbidities like autism, trauma, or major depression are clearly present.
So the point is that normal psychiatric assessment was being truncated.
Exactly. Safeguarding processes were inconsistent, and practitioners who expressed caution described a culture where the gender-affirming paradigm overshadowed ordinary clinical judgment.
It sounds like caution was activated. The sources frame the significance of Tavistock not just as a single clinic, but as this symbolic break that demonstrated the medical establishment was not unified.
It was. It showed that caution had been subordinated to ideology and that quiet professional misgivings were numerous and long-standing. So when the NHS, the ultimate UK health authority, closed the service down, it marked the first official body concession that the entire gender care model for minors had drifted too far too fast.
And this wasn't political. This was professional accountability.
Right. And that professional concession set the stage for what the sources rightly call the true earthquake, the Cass report.
Dr. Hilary Cass's multi-year, system-wide review of pediatric gender published in 2020.
And it constituted the most authoritative repudiation to date of the existing model. This was not noise from a partisan activist. This was institutional authority speaking with clinical rigor.
Let's dedicate some serious time to these findings because they are crucial to understanding the cultural shift. What were the key clinical conclusions that really undermine the foundation of that affirm first approach?
The findings were devastating because they challenged the clinical foundations of the past decade. First, regarding puberty blockers, Cass found that there was no high-quality evidence supporting their use as a beneficial or even neutral intervention.
And just for the listener, puberty blockers are powerful hormone medications that temporarily pause physical development. The theory was that they gave teens time to think.
Correct. But Cass found no reliable evidence that they actually improve long-term psychological well-being or reduce dysphoria in youth, and serious questions remained about their long-term effects on things like bone density and fertility.
That immediately undercuts the medical necessity narrative. What about the source of the rising referral?
Cass confirmed that the explosion in referrals, particularly among adolescent girls, that ROGD group Rowling was concerned about, was linked to complex social factors, including social contagion and peer influence.
Echoing Rowling's own cited research.
It did. Furthermore, and perhaps most important, the report concluded that the mental health needs of these young people, their oppression, their trauma, their autism, had been routinely overshadowed by a doctrinized focus on gender identity alone. The medical necessity of transition was displacing ordinary, necessary psychiatric care.
The implication is pretty clear. The clinical foundations of the past decade had been built on sand, prioritizing identity over holistic care.
And the profound impact of that was that the report provided an epistemic permission slip for the ordinary public.
Epistemic, meaning relating to knowledge.
Exactly. People who had long been uneasy, parents, educators, moderate liberals, but were intimidated by the activist certainty that science says otherwise, now had authoritative institutional evidence confirming their caution. It was a signal that the experts themselves were walking the entire field back.
So the certainty that drove the cultural establishment's condemnation of Rowling was now being utterly undermined by clinical,
which was then almost immediately followed by the legal confirmation. The UK Supreme Court ruling of 2025. This was the final institutional check.
And this decision was monumental.
It was unanimous and definitive. The terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 referred to a biological woman and biological sex.
And why was that ruling so critical for the...
It reasserted the primacy of biological sex in law, which is what Rowling had been arguing for all along. It signaled a decisive shift away from legislative ambiguity. It provided clarity for institutions that deal with vulnerable populations, prisons, sports bodies, hospital wards, single-sex services.
So those single-sex exemptions, the ones that protect women-only spaces, were now legally affirmed.
They were. And it signaled that institutional authority, the courts and policymakers, were no longer willing to outsource definitions to ideological pressure.
And the public reaction to this legal clarity was instantaneous.
Absolutely. The April 2025 UK polling found majorities supporting this court ruling, and crucially, majorities backed the exclusion of trans women from women's sports and single-sex toilets. Public opinion was quickly catching up to the institutional findings of both the court and the Cass report.
And we saw this shift mirrored across the Atlantic, right? Suggesting a broader cultural movement. The U.S. attitude shifts show parallel movements away from the affirm first model.
Yeah. A majority of U.S. adults now oppose medical intervention, puberty blockers, surgeries for trans-identified minors. Furthermore, recent data on youth identification from Eric Kaufman in 2025 shows that the wave of gender nonconformity among young people appears to have peaked.
That Kaufman data is astonishing, and it needs to be clearly emphasized. We are talking about the share of U.S. college undergraduates identifying as trans or non-binary dropping substantially from about 6.8% in 2020
to between 3 and 3.6% in 2025.
That is nearly a 50% drop in self-identification among a key demographic in just statistically and attitudinally. The tide had unequivocally turned by the initial condemnation of Rowling was predicated on the idea that the activist consensus was based on sound science, necessary inclusion, and the inevitable. By 2025, that certainty had been shattered by the very institute designed to govern clinical and...
So what does this all mean for our central figure? Rowling, once a pariah, now stands vindicated by time, according to the sources. Let's bring this analysis home. How did her unique, isolated ideological position, too left for the right, too biologically realist for the left, how did that ultimately play out in her favor once the institutions began backtrack?
It all comes down to what our sources call the payoff of independence. Her long-term legitimacy comes directly from the apps because she stayed true to her core position, a mainstream progressive with one key heterodox. She avoided being culturally tainted by righteousness.
Let's spend a little more time on that. Why was that distinction, avoiding being weaponized by the political right, so strategically beneficial for her in the long run? Because it allowed her stance to remain principled, not tribal. She fought a specific ethical cause rather than a wholesale culture war. She was fighting for single-sex protections and clinical caution, not generally railing against liberal culture or the existence of trans people. This preserved her moral clarity, especially for those on the fence.
And this served as a kind of off-ramp for moderate, centrists, and even lifelong liberals who were rethinking the issue after the Cass report.
Exactly. For most liberal or centrist audiences, the critical psychological barrier to changing their mind is accepting that they are, in part, siding with a figure or movement they associate with the far right. That triggers tribal identity alarm. It feels like ideological defection.
And Rowling never imposed that second fatal tribal step?
Never. They only had one step to cross. Do I think the Cass reward is right? Do I think the law should protect biological sex? If yes, well then she was broadly right on sex and gender.
Because she kept her position culturally untainted by right-wing co-option, it functioned as a psychological permission structure for moderates.
And as institutional verdicts, the Cass report, court rulings, policy reversals moved in her direction, she became easier, not harder, to re-accept as a voice of reason.
Her vindication was less about her changing individual minds through argument.
Though she certainly tried. It was more about authoritative institutions changing the operational rules of discourse. She acquired this retrospective aura of foresight because the data, the science, and the law ultimately affirmed the caution she had been arguing for all along. It made the institutional condemnation of 2020 look increasingly short-sighted and ideologically driven.
And this narrative shift led directly to the punctuation mark, the emotional conclusion to the whole saga, the Emma Watson exchange. This exchange, which the sources describe as cathartic and somehow socioculturally juicy, marked the final decisive shift of the cultural tide.
It's a fascinating moment. Emma Watson, who was a public stalwart of the transgender cause and had publicly dissented from Rowling in 2020, went on a podcast and tried yet again, even in 2025, to reconcile her deep love and gratitude for Joe, that's Rowling, with her ideological disagreement.
And she said she must hold these two seemingly incompatible things together at the same time and just hope that maybe they will one day resolve or co-join themselves. She really emphasized the personal connection.
She did. She said, "I will never believe that one negates the other, and that my experience of that person I don't get to keep and cherish." It was a clear attempt to soften her position, maybe sensing the cultural wind was changing.
But that softening was met with an unsparing and frankly devastating public response from Rowling, a senile moment.
It was.
Yeah.
Rowling called Watson's attempt a change of tack. I suspect she's adopted because she's noticed full-throated condemnation of me is no longer quite as fashionable as it was.
That quote is a serious power. It reads less like an argument and more like a declaration that the cultural war is, at least institutionally, over. Rowling did not accept the olive branch.
Not at all. And she followed up by critiquing Watson's immense privilege. Very sharp. She stated that Emma and her co-stars had assumed the role of de facto spokespeople for the world she created, and that Watson, like other people who've never experienced adult life uncushioned by wealth and fame, was ignorant of how ignorant she is.
Her critique centered on a contrast of life experience, hitting back at the very people who had provided the most visible institutional challenge to her reputation.
Right. She contrasted Watson's gilded privilege with her own life experience of being poor while writing the books and raising her children. She said she understood with a trashing of women's rights in which Emma has so enthusiastically participated means to women and girls without her privilege. She framed the entire debate not through the lens of identity politics, but through the lens of structural poverty and safety for vulnerable women.
And after years of these serious, emotionally driven rows, the cultural sense around this exchange was that it was faintly amusing.
It was. Rowling had maintained silence while Watson enjoyed cultural affirmation, and her unsparing reply confirmed that the era of uncontested elite condemnation was truly over. The cultural tide had shifted decisively away from Watson's position and squarely toward the legal and clinical realities that now supported Rowling's core argument.
So if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, the J.K. Rowling case illustrates a really critical dynamic in modern that
It does. When established institutional consensus, especially medical, scientific, or legal, begins to crack, public opinion, which may have long been suppressed by fear of social penalty or shaming, rapidly shifts to align with the new institutional reality.
Her vindication was less about her winning a debate through superior rhetoric
and more about authoritative institutions like the NHS, the courts, and clinical science changing the operational rules of discourse for everyone.
We've seen how staying meticulously out of tribal politics, even while taking a deeply controversial stand, can ultimately preserve legitimacy. The cultural shift was not driven by popular revolt, but confirmed by data, science, and the law, which is a powerful lesson for anyone navigating complex social issues today where public perception often lags behind institutional reality.
Absolutely. The sources present a complete reversal of the cultural narrative in just 5 years, moving from an institutional condemnation fueled by ideological certainty to a clinical and legal vindication fueled by evidence and precedent.
And finally, a final provocative thought for you, the listener. We discussed the powerful narrative that framed the younger trans movement as stubbornly determined young voices were finally being. Given the recent data we discussed, Eric Kaufman's analysis showing the wave of gender nonconformity peaking among U.S. college students, dropping substantially from nearly 7% in 2022 to around 3% in 2025. What future cultural narrative will emerge to explain the rapid rise and subsequent steep drop in youth identification observed in that period? It is something for you to mull or explore on your own as the long-term history of this moment is written.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.